This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I think an hour.
Then I have plenty of time.
Okay. I guess I'm kicking it off, huh? Everybody got quiet.
Then we should tune.
Shall I just kick us off? Yeah? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Emory University. My name is William Ransom. I'm Director of Piano Studies here in the Department of Music, and we are so honored and excited to have these two wonderful guests with us today. Simone Dinnerstein will be playing a recital tonight at 8 o'clock right here. I'm sure you all know, and will be there. And of course, Robert Spano, Music Director of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra and distinguished professor of everything here at Emory University, who has also recently been named as Artistic Director of the Aspens Festival. Very exciting news for him as well. So we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to sort of kick things off here. And towards the end, we'll have time for questions as well. So please be thinking of questions also. This is part of a series of conversations we have across the campus, developed by Rosemary McGee, Secretary of the University, of all sorts of interesting and wonderful guests to the campus and some resident faculty as well. And our next one is coming up on April the 4th at 4:30 in 7th. Thank you. April 7th at 4:30 in the Carlos Museum, and we'll be with John Anthony Lennon, one of our wonderful faculty composers who's written a major new work for orchestra and chorus that will be premiered in about 2 weeks here on campus as well. So we hope you'll join us for that. Our guest today, as I said, Robert Spano, is Music Director of the Atlanta Symphony. Simone Dinnerstein is a wonderful concert artist who has taken the world by storm in the last few years, originally with some incredible Bach recordings, and now is touring the world as a professional concert pianist. Welcome. We're delighted you're here. I'd like to ask first if you two have worked together yet as collaborative artists.
We just met.
Yes. I used to conduct my hometown orchestra, the Brooklyn Philharmonic.
You're from Brooklyn?
I'm from Brooklyn. And I remember very vividly when I was a student at Tanglewood, when you came and conducted, and I remember Brahms' First Symphony and everybody being extremely excited, and I was playing sonatas with the concertmaster, and she was very nervous.
She had a big solo.
She had a big solo.
When you are working with a conductor or with an orchestra, what is it that you look for? What makes a really great experience for you as a soloist, coming in, a day or two before with maybe 1 or 2 rehearsals and then multiple performances?
Well, I like to talk to the conductor and play. I like to play before we get together with the orchestra. I love it when conductors want to talk about the music and want to hear what I have discovered myself, because, of course, I've spent a really long time working on my concerto, and they might not have spent as long a time thinking about the concerto as I did. So it's really great when you meet somebody who wants to listen, and then you kind of bounce ideas off of each other, and it feels like chamber music. I mean, I think that when concertos are like chamber music, that's the ideal situation. And some orchestras feel that way, like they feel involved, and they want to be involved, and you can kind of tell when you're in rehearsing with them, and even in the concerts, that they're listening to you and the conductor. It's a 3-part kind of dialogue. And those are the best experiences for me when that happens.
And is that the norm, or it happens sometimes or often, or it just depends?
It really depends. I think it's like meeting a new person, like making friends. Sometimes you instantly hit it off, sometimes you don't. I've had some bad experiences where conductors just were completely not interested in that at all, and I felt kind of abandoned in the concerts. But then I've had other experiences where I've just absolutely fallen in love the moment we met, and the orchestra felt great and positive and optimistic. Some orchestras don't feel optimistic when you walk in, and some orchestras do. And I think that's interesting. There's a kind of group dynamic, a group energy. As a solo pianist, I'm not used to playing in an orchestra, and I'm not used to the whole idea of, I mean, it's really like working with a mass of people. I think there's a whole element to orchestras that is reflective of society, and it's not, it's different than anything else that I encounter.
There's the old joke about working with a conductor where you go in and tell the conductor what you'd like to do, and the conductor says, don't worry, I'll be right behind you. And you say, yeah, a beat behind me. What do you look for in a soloist? What makes that spark happen, and for you to say, oh, this is going to be a special concerto?
I actually love the opportunity to try and shapeshift into the musical paradigm that the soloist brings to the project. That's the thrill for me. I have to figure out what I think for the rest of the program, how it should go, how it should be. And so often, well, you've probably heard the phrase, play what's written. And in fact, that's just impossible, because what's written is visual, and what happens is oral. And what happens is in time. The score is more like GPS. And I think we all know what it's like to hit that roadblock or the one-way street that you weren't told about. So the reality of a musical journey that we call a piece, it's in fact not an object, which is also interesting. We talk about the Mozart piano concerto, the Beethoven symphony, the Bach this or that, but they don't exist. They're possibilities, they're journeys that we can enter into, and the map is given to us, and the map is flawed. So when you were saying I've spent so much time living with this concerto and preparing, I feel so honored to participate in that. So when a soloist comes, because I've been doing that too, but with a concerto, when I'm preparing to accompany a concerto, I try not to decide, but to question. And then to see what decisions the soloist is bringing and wanting to buy into them. And usually I can, because I'm a pretty eclectic, I either have eclectic taste or no taste. But I enjoy the opportunity to buy into another point of view, and I try not to formulate too concrete a point of view in my own mind, whereas I'm doing the opposite with the symphony that's on the same program. I'm trying to have a very rich and fleshed out vision of what I want to have happen. And there are occasions where it just doesn't work. There's that wonderful occasion where Leonard Bernstein was supposed to be doing the Brahms Second Piano Concerto with Glenn Gould. Well, he did do it, sort of. But he started off with a disclaimer: I have nothing to do with this. I had nothing to do with the result of this, and basically blaming Gould for what was about to happen. And it is true that sometimes you can't get your aesthetic taste to mesh. You can't find common ground. But my experience is more often than not, I do find common ground, and I relish the gift of someone else's interpretive vision.
And I think one of the great joys of music and of performance is exactly that obviously everybody has their own conception. That's why it's a living art that will never die, because it changes every single time. And I'm curious from both of you, when you have an opportunity, say with a concerto and you're playing Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or Thursday, Friday, Saturday nights, how consciously, or do you consciously try and do something different each time when you have 3 in a row like that? Or if you're making a recital tour and you have 10 recitals in 12 days. That I know some musicians who say this is the way it is, and I'm always going to play it this way, and some who like to be more spontaneous and actively change things. I'm curious what your philosophy is.
Well, I think things can't help but change because the circumstances change and you feel different and everything is different every night. With a concerto, I don't know if it's that I haven't had enough experience yet, but I feel concerned to change something too much because you've finished rehearsing at that point. And what if you do something and they can't follow what you're doing? So I tend to kind of keep things within bounds. I mean, I might change, I will change aspects of what I'm doing, things I didn't feel were as good or could be better, but I wouldn't change an interpretation too much. Unless I was playing with a conductor that I'd worked with a lot, who I knew could really figure that out. In a recital, it's different. A recital, I think, I do change, and actually one of the main things that makes me change how I play is the instrument that I'm using, because every instrument has different strengths and weaknesses, and every hall that you play in has different kinds of acoustics, and that affects how I interpret the music.
And as a conductor, how much can one do differently, say in a series of 3 concerts in a row, without telling the orchestra beforehand, you know, we're going to do something different tonight, just showing it?
Well, somehow change happens whether you want it or not. And I find more that I don't always, sometimes I set out to change something, but that's more unusual than things changing on me. And in terms of the orchestra, orchestras are marvelously flexible in terms of affecting any change I might wish to do. It's interesting that there's a notion that around that I hear often about things are prepared in rehearsal and then the work is done. But in a way, the rehearsal is preparation for the work to be done. And the concerts are as engaged in a process as the rehearsals were. There's a Greek concept called kairos. It's a time word, like Kronos, who is also a god of time, like Saturn. But kairos is a word about knowing what to do at the right moment. And I think an example that I can't remember which pre-Socratic used it, but I think it was one of those guys. A ship in a storm. And if you're sailing the ship, what's needed at what moment is critical at even life and death matter.
Well, tell me a little bit about programming. When, obviously, if you have a solo recital, you're pretty much free to choose what you want, if the sponsors will accept it. But when you're asked to play a concerto, especially these days in terms of where you are in your career, how much choice do you have to say, I would like to play this, and maybe they come back and say, no, we want you to play this. Where are you with that?
Well, I'm in a much stronger position at the moment than I was. I tend to, I don't like to have a very large repertoire, so I have to be very careful about what I choose to play. And so I usually have about 4 concertos that I have each season. And if an orchestra would like to play them, that's great. And if they don't, then I don't play with them, basically. I had a few exceptions to this in the past few years. For some reason, I was engaged to play all the Liszt piano concertos, which I never would have thought would have been it would not have been music that I would have chosen to play. But they were kind of opportunities I couldn't turn down. And it was actually interesting doing that because it stretched me in a different way to work on music that had totally not interested me and to find out what interested me in it, and the things that, the reasons why I hadn't liked it, which really didn't come from the music. You know, it's great music. So that was good to push me to do that. And now I'm starting to be interested in commissioning pieces too, and I have a wonderful composer, Philip Lasser, who I've commissioned to write a piano concerto for me, and I'm very excited about that. So, you know, I'm starting to be more choosy, because I realize that in the end, if I'm not doing what I'm good at doing and what I can do in terms of time, I'm not doing myself any service. So.
And as a conductor, music director who plans out seasons or festivals, do you try to match specific people with specific pieces, or is it just sometimes there's a piece you want and there's a number of people to choose from, or there's a person you want and you say, what would you like to play? How does it work in your world?
Like that.
All of the above.
All of the above. In terms of working with soloists, it is often any one of those things. I was fascinated with what you were saying about not liking something and engaging it and finding things you love about it. And I find that that's true for me too, the fluidity of aptitude or interest or appreciation or skill. And I know that there are some things that I love that I'm not terribly good at. And then there are things that I don't love so much that I'm very good at. And then there's the wonderful combination of things that fulfill me very deeply that I also know I'm good at. And those are not fixed categories. I was fascinated with that fluidity I was reflecting on myself while you were talking, because I've been so fortunate to surprise myself. Those of you who are ASO subscribers know Bruckner at the ASO through the performances of Donald Runnicles. And there's a reason for that. Because I hate Bruckner. and I love it when he does it. Because suddenly I forget that I don't like it, because he's so good at it. And then I found, last year I was asked to do a Bruckner symphony, and I asked Donald if I should bother. And he gave me some marvelous advice that took me inside the symphony in a way that I don't think I could have found without the help. And then I ended up having a marvelous time, and I loved Bruckner. At least I loved doing it. I don't know that I would have loved sitting through it. But his insight was so helpful to me, because he gave me two kernels that changed my perspective. And one was that Bruckner was an organist, so he was improvising alone in that church all the time. And he'd play something and think, oh, that was good, so he'd play it again, which is a different kind of attitude. And then he said, compare him to Messiaen, who was also an organist who spent an inordinate amount of time in church improvising on his own. And the thing that Messiaen does that I'm well versed in, because I've performed a lot of Messiaen, is create these big panels of sound that then alternate with other big panels of sound. It's very different from the narrative quality of, say, a Mahler symphony, where the drama continues to unfold and evolve. Rather, this is a kind of mosaic structure with very large blocks. And that served me very well. So I found myself having a wonderful experience with something that I wouldn't have expected to have. And I've also found that things that I once loved very deeply are less important to me. And I think that that's terrific, that it's not a static experience to engage any artistic thing, both as a generator and as a perceiver. I think it's great that is in a constant evolution. But in terms of programming, the issues of programming with a soloist for me, specific to the soloist, not in the sense of, well, sometimes in the sense of we want that soloist to do that thing, but other times it's because I know the soloist, and so it's, what are you interested in now? The thing we know you do well, or do you want to try something else, or what should we do this time? Because I have the people I work with all the time, or often, and then there are the people that I'm just meeting, and if we were to work together soon, I'd be interested in what you wanted to do without so much knowledge of what you've been doing, and wanting to meet you on that footing first. But then the games of exploration, I think, are fantastic.
Also, people suggest things, like, in fact, it was last year when I was playing with the Atlanta Symphony, it was with Christian Yarvi conducting, and Evans Mirages was there, who's sort of the artistic advisor to the Atlanta Symphony, and they were both talking to me afterwards about my repertoire and what concertos they thought I should do, which I found very interesting to hear what other people that I respect think about me. And they both thought that I should be playing the Ravel Concerto. And this was something that I'd also heard from another conductor. So next season I'm going to be playing the Ravel Concerto. And I would not have maybe thought of doing that if I hadn't had these different people who had different perceptions about me say that.
Interesting. The G major?
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful. If you were having a conversation between the two of you, and Robert said, what, besides Ravel, what do you dream of? What would be a dream project for you, concerto-wise, with a fine orchestra?
Well, I would say, I mean, knowing his conducting and I guess the eclecticism of what you do, I would think it'd be really interesting to pair a new work with an old work. I think that would be very cool. I'm actually going to be recording the Ravel Concerto with two other concertos, with the commissioned Lasser Concerto and with the Rhapsody in Blue, to have a sort of French-American program. And I think that, I'm hoping that I'll be doing like the Lasser and the Gershwin together, because they're both going to be short concertos. I mean, I would probably talk about things that, I mean, I heard the Brahms. I would want to do Brahms, maybe. I mean, I think Brahms' Second Concerto has always been something that I wanted to do, but I don't think I'm ready quite yet. But it's something in my future I hope I'm going to get to. So when that happens, I hope I do it with the right person.
Right.
So.
Robert was mentioning Bruckner improvising, and also, I guess, a soloist improvising a bit during a concerto. When you play a Mozart concerto, do you improvise cadenzas or in advance, think through them, write them out yourselves, or do you tend to perform written ones?
Yeah, I'm not an improviser. I mean, I've just started improvising. I've been working with a singer-songwriter doing a program, and it's my first time improvising, but that's like pop improvising, which is quite different, It's much easier, and I think much more fun. But in Mozart Concerto, I have inadvertently improvised. The story that you all found so funny was actually my nightmare one time. These things can happen. But I don't know. I don't. I mean, I don't think it's my skill to do that. So, but I am interested in playing interesting cadenzas. Like I've been playing the C major, the Koelschel 4-6-7, and I've been doing Busoni's cadenzas, which are really wild and chromatic and crazy. And I have also commissioned people to write cadenzas for me. I think it'd be really interesting to have a jazz pianist write a cadenza. But I don't feel capable of doing it myself.
Tonight you're playing a solo recital, which I always find the most taxing. I mean, obviously it's the longest amount of time that we have to perform, and it's just you up there. It is very taxing, and the travel and everything else that goes along with your life is very difficult. And I'm curious, do you have a routine that you've come to now? Do you enjoy the touring life? Do you embrace it, or do you say, oh, I've got to go on the road again?
I feel pretty conflicted about it. I think that I'm incredibly fortunate to be doing what I'm doing, so I feel extremely reluctant to complain about it, because I think that the life that I have at the moment is the one that I dreamt about having from when I was a little girl. But I have a family. I have a husband and a son, and I am missing lots of time with them, and that is really kind of unbearable. So, but on the other hand, I feel a kind of calling to be doing what I'm doing. I think that being a musician, I don't really regard it as so much as being an entertainer as being as opening a door for people in a concert to an experience that is necessary to have, that people need to have, and I feel like I need to be doing that, but I also feel like I need to be with my family. So, yeah, I don't really, there's no answer.
A difficult balance.
Yeah.
And then more concretely, for example, on a concert day like today, do you have specific things that you always like to do? Do you exercise? Do you take a nap to prepare you for the experience of 2 hours on stage?
Unfortunately, I'm more of a napper than an exerciser.
A power napper, though, right?
I like to practice pretty intensely in the morning, and then completely zone out in the afternoon. And that seems to be the best way for me to prepare for a concert. I need to clear my head out. Being a musician is also kind of like running a business. There are all these different things that you have to do regarding, with your manager and your publicist and the record label, and there's like all this stuff and emails, lots of emails and things, and I find it very, very distracting. So I try to just kind of tune out all of that on the day of a concert if I possibly can, and just kind of, clear my head.
And for you as a conductor, do you have a ritual before on concert day, which is almost every day for you?
Trying to think of one of those infomercials. We should do one on napping. Who was that woman with the really short hair?
Susan Power.
Yeah.
Susan Power.
And what was her catchphrase?
Something about getting rid of fat.
Just stop the insanity.
Oh, right.
I think snapping is the key to stopping the insanity. Because I nap as well. I love that you said you called your work a calling, and it's so rare anymore. I find we talk about professions, but we don't talk about vocations. And the vocation is precisely that, a calling. And I think most of us who end up doing this feel compelled, even though it demands some discomfort in choices we make in our lives. And I don't know I don't know who's calling. But one does feel called. As my grandmother used to say, many are called, but few get up.
I always heard many are cold, but few are frozen.
But there is a feeling compelled about it, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's not choice involved at some point, except to choose to do the thing about which you have no choice. And napping is a part of it. I find that I need my subconscious, and my best access to it is sleep. And I find that and it also, as you said, I find the need to clear out the stuff that's part of my life that doesn't need to be in the space where I'm about to do the work, the artistic work, the actual work with the material of sound. And I need to clear my head, but also infuse it with another intelligence that I have, which is subterranean.
Yeah, as a teacher, students will often come to you and say, well, I think I'd like to go into music. And you know right then what to tell them, because if they don't know they have to go into music, then they shouldn't be going into music.
I always said the same thing. No, then you don't want to.
Yeah. You have to be called. If you're not chosen, you have to be called. I've always thought. You play, of course, across the board, solo recitals, concertos, and chamber music as well. Do you feel particularly drawn to any one of those genres, or it just totally depends on the repertoire and the experience?
Well, I actually think that the best repertoire is written for chamber music. I think that it's, I don't know why, I just think that composers tend to excel in chamber music. But playing chamber music can either be a wonderful experience or not. And it depends who you're playing with. And I also really like to, well, you have to feel communicative with those people. I had an experience a couple of weeks ago. I spent the week with Richard Stoltzman, the clarinetist, and we played recitals the whole week together. And it was just amazing. I mean, it was just like the ideal musical experience. We actually didn't rehearse very much because as soon as we started playing together, it was like we'd known each other for years, and it felt like breathing with somebody else and playing. I wasn't thinking about what I was doing, and I don't think he was either. In fact, it was just it was a really unusual experience, which was great. But recitals, I absolutely love, solo recitals, for many reasons. One is I like to create my own recital program. I think that that is really a really interesting thing to think about a program and where you want to go with that program. And then you are all the instruments in a recital, you know, like you're the whole orchestra and the conductor. And when it goes well, it is really an incredible experience because you feel like you have created a total experience. You know, you are the whole artist. I mean, it doesn't always happen that it goes like that, but when it does, it's pretty amazing.
Going back to programming for a bit, from a conductor's standpoint, we are sort of in the midst of most orchestral programs having a soloist at some point, maybe in the middle always. Do you feel constricted by that in terms of running a major symphony and having certain expectations that there be a soloist on most of the programs? How difficult is it for you, in a sense, to program around that, or do you feel that constriction at all?
I find that most constrictions are opportunities. And that, in fact, the most difficult thing about programming is what to leave out.
Yeah.
Because there's always too much. And in fact, a lot of the processes, I've been around Emory for a couple of weeks now, so I find myself saying the same things. I hope you haven't heard this before. But there's the yes and no of creating something. And the yes part is sort of obvious. We want to make this thing, we want to create that thing, but the issue is also what to leave out. There's also the no. Debussy's famous response to how do you compose was, well, I take all the notes and I leave out the ones I don't like. and however humorous it is, it's actually kind of well pointed to a fact of making anything. that has to do with leaving things out. So when I get a restriction, for me, it's already, okay, that rules out the 322 other possibilities that we could have put there. So I actually find and often we know what soloist it is, even if it's not exactly what piece, earlier than other aspects of programming because of the necessity of booking their calendars so that we can have them. So it's a practical, and there's another practical concern that creates a constriction that helps, that I find to be a help in then generating what we end up with. For me, programming is endlessly fascinating because there are so many ways to put an evening together. It's just endless, which is why we need the know. And in programming for the symphony, I try and make sure that every program self-sufficiently has a coherence, although that coherence might be in the very fact of the variety of things that happen in the course of a couple hours. And also that it have an intuitive sense of being enjoyed in the same way one would enjoy a meal. It'd be a shame to have the ice cream before the steak. And I think I'm constantly trying to find some intuitive sense that we're getting the next taste in the right order after what we just had. And sometimes it makes no sense on paper. And other times, things that make great sense on paper are actually just horrible actual experiences. So I'm always trying to test what looks good on paper with predicting what the experience will be. There have been programs that I was so dubious of that I had to play them, I had to get recordings of everything involved and live through it myself in real time to know if I honestly believed we should be doing that. And other times your hunch is right and you just know but we have an extraordinarily weird program coming up. And I hope it works, and I really won't know until we live it. But we're starting with Bach, Gottes Zeit ist der allerbestes Zeit, which is an early cantata of his God's time is the very best time. It's a funeral cantata. And then the Totenfeier of Mahler, which is the first movement of the Second Symphony, and then we're doing just the march from the funeral music of Queen Mary of Purcell, immediately, which is played in the balcony, then immediately followed by Blue Cathedral of Jennifer Higdon, which is an elegy upon the death of her brother, and then the third act of La Bohème, which is where Mimi's imminent death is apparent. Wow. And the only thing that binds them is that everybody dies. But I think, in fact, it's a program that will be a wonderful kind of meditation on mortality, and from many different perspectives and many different sound worlds, and I hope it works. And that's one where it has a certain fascination on paper. I know that there's a project in New York at Carnegie Hall called Spring for Music, and they're inviting orchestras from around the country to play in this series of Spring for Music, and the unifying idea of that series is interesting programming. And we submitted that program to them, and they wanted us to be the kickoff orchestra for that whole series on the basis of that program, but we couldn't afford to go. So, but it was interesting that program, we sent a couple other programs too, and that's the program that caught their fancy, which kind of astounded me, because it's an unsafe program.
I have a pianist friend who's a little bit older, and he programs on every concert now, every recital that he plays, either the Chopin Funeral March Sonata or the Beethoven Funeral March or Liszt Funerai, something to do with death, because he wants to die on stage and be known as the pianist who died while he was playing this piece. I offered to help him out, but he didn't.
Well, I didn't get the right soloist for that concert.
Do you have major projects in your future that you're looking forward to? You know, all the Beethoven sonatas, all the preludes and fugues, something like that at this point? Again, sort of a larger programming question.
Well, not like that. I mean, the concerto disc that I'm going to be recording is a big project for me, and this other thing that I've been doing with this singer-songwriter, Tiv Tamarit, that has been a big project, which we will record. And talk about programming, that was very interesting because she's a kind of folk rock country singer, and she never had sung any classical music. And so we kind of taught each other how to do different things. And so, you know, we do things like juxtapose, have Dido's Lament, followed by Billie Holiday's Don't Explain.
Nice.
And we tried to create a program that would meld those two worlds, and where she would sing in her way Schubert, you know, and I would play Cat Stevens, how it makes sense for me to play it, you know. So that's been really exciting and a real departure for me. But in terms of like learning all the Beethoven sonatas, no. I mean, I don't want to do that, but I think I would like to do like all the Beethoven piano concertos, and that would be really exciting. I don't feel the need to do like all the works of one composer, you know. My time is limited, and I actually don't like all the 32 Beethoven sonatas.
Heresy. How did your relationship with the singer come about? Were you friends, or did someone introduce you with this project in mind?
We were introduced. She interviewed me for a magazine, and because the magazine wanted somebody from another genre to interview me. And so we wound up getting to know each other, listening to each other's music, and then we had this long interview, and we realized that we had so much in common, and it was so interesting because we came from such different worlds. But our musical sensibilities are actually very similar, even though we're different styles. And so we thought it'd be really interesting to try to do something together, and Duke University wound up, their presenting organization wound up backing this whole project, and we had a residency there and commissioned 3 composers to write songs for us.
Original song.
Yeah, and Brad Meldau wrote a song, and Patty Griffin and Philip Lasser, and then we just thought about all that. We had loads of sending songs back and forth, and her introducing me to all these songs that I didn't know, and I introduced her to songs she didn't know, and it was just fascinating. And the Schubert song that we're doing, Night and Dreams, was great because I had a vision of it that we would translate it, and then she would rework the words into a way that makes sense for her as a singer and as a songwriter. So she kind of redid the words. And then in the middle, I thought it'd be brilliant if I took over the melody and she played the harmonica. And it is incredible. It's like country, blues, and Schubert, but it doesn't lose anything, you know. It's really, it's very interesting, the whole project.
Wonderful. And have you performed this yet, or it's coming up, and will you do performances and recordings of this?
We have performed it this past couple of months ago, and then this past week we actually did a little private concert, and the people from my record label heard it, and they have agreed to record it.
Wonderful.
So I'm very excited about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very exciting. I love projects like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Terrific. Well, do we have some questions from the audience? Yes.
First of all, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to meet you and to thank you personally, because I have to tell you, I'm a painter, I'm a visual artist, and your Goldberg variations have been on infinite repeat in my studio for about a year and a half now, which has driven everyone else in my house crazy. Along with, admittedly, occasional Bob Marley, but mainly Goldberg variations. So it's very connected to me as a visual artist, the structure that you're playing on with what I've been doing. So if I have a question, this is very difficult. I've been particularly trying to think, how do I ask this question? I know as an artist how it feels, that sense of it, that essentially you can lay on as many layers as you want, of complexity, ornamentation, as long as the architecture is there. But I find that for me personally, I know how it feels to follow all of that simultaneously in a painting, because you perceive all some things, and what happens in times. But it's all there. The music is moving, and I know that I can't follow each of those voices intellectually at the same time. So I find that that's part of what I love about Bach, is that I just have to relax and like wash over it. It makes perfect sense. And that puts me in that space to be able to do what I'm going to do. It forces you to relax. But I'm wondering, certainly for a performer like you, certainly for a conductor, how do you experience internally that sense of organization of all of these simultaneous layers and voices going simultaneously? How does that feel? I don't know if you need an answer to that. Am I expressing this?
It doesn't feel relaxing.
Well, I'm alone, you see. That's watching while I'm working.
I think what you said is so beautiful about the experience of something of the complexity of Bach, which is one where all these different elements are harmonized. And in fact, this is the distinguishing feature of Western European musical tradition, is counterpoint. We gave up. If you go to 1100 Paris, there's an interest on the musicians of the day there in creating simultaneity and harmony with having multiplicity and having it all sound good together, which meant writing things out because people had to be more predictable. If you think about a jazz group who's improvising, they turn it over by turns to each other who's in charge, who's in the lead. But if your interest is in having everything that's happening have its own beautiful independence and autonomy almost, and then have it all work together, things are going to have to be more predictable. So in fact, the system of notation that we developed over hundreds of years started then, so that we could have the multiplicity of voices be predictable so as to control the harmonious result. And other world traditions didn't do that. Traditional Chinese music, Indian raga, African drumming, but they pursued other things to much greater degrees of complexity and subtlety than we did, including how to divide the scale in Indian raga, including the rhythmic complexity of African drumming. Our rhythmic activity became so much more narrowly confined by our effort to create this possibility of harmony and multiplicity. And we didn't really get out of that until the 20th century, when the notational system had developed. What did Blake say? If a fool persists in his folly, he shall become wise. So we persisted in this folly to the point where our notational system allowed us to write down the kind of rhythmic complexity we'd forsaken for a few hundred years. And I think this this level of complexity that we've been able to engage is what science is now telling us, so it must be true because that's our Catholicism, is that the brain can only deal with two of those things at a time. And so what must be happening for the performer, who must attentively, now as a listener, you can let that do its thing, which is marvelous. As a performer, if you're tending to all those things, really what's happening is you're oscillating the attention. If you've got four voices, you're oscillating the attention from two to these two to that two quickly enough that you're actually tending to all of them at the same time. And I know in my own training, Bach was my primary teacher for doing that by practicing chorales of Bach and the art of fugue written out four voices with multiple old clefs, which makes life even more interesting. and then solfeging one voice and playing the other three. So the other aspect of that trains the mind to be more nimble in where it's putting its attention is having to utilize different physical faculties. Both singing and playing at the same time is already a challenge for someone who can't sing to begin with. So that I know that exercise that I did for hours a day for years and still do to a great extent because it's how I learn scores. I don't sing so much because I have neighbors. That's a way of getting that capacity to shift attention to be more cultivated.
It's interesting that you say that because I also studied for a while with a teacher who had me do that with Bach, where I would play, like if I was working on a fugue, I'd play two voices and sing the third, or leave out one altogether and do the others. But this is a fascinating thing about, I mean, I have absolutely no clue how a conductor can keep it all. I don't understand.
We don't.
And actually, even more, the thing that really perplexes me the most is how the composers could hear all of that. That's the main thing that I can't understand. Like, how on earth do they know? You know, but the most I have to do is 4 voices, occasionally 5. And what's very interesting to me is I tend to practice the voices separately a lot. And I think about how I want them to be shaped. I mean, this is not just Bach, this is in Schumann too. But when I listen to a recording of myself playing, and I hear that each voice has its own direction and its own shape, I can't remember how I did that. You know, like, and I think that, I mean, it probably, most likely it is that you're shifting very quickly. But I also feel like there's something kind of mysterious that goes on where there's like a part of your mind that is following each part and is completely consumed with just that part, that voice. And you may not have your attention on it with your conscious mind, but unconsciously you do. Because I've played performances where I've heard a recording afterwards and had absolutely no recollection that I had been doing what I was doing with one of the voices, but it was very purposefully being played in a certain kind of a way.
There's a great line that popped in my head from E. E. Cummings, who said, I never know what I'm doing, but I surely must be doing what I know.
That's, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you think your when you were saying that, I was thinking your memory is playing a big part in that too, isn't it? When you were talking about practicing each voice
Right.
by itself, then that creates memory that serves when it's all put back together, don't you?
Definitely, and then there's also that, I mean, that leads to another mysterious thing, which is kinesthetic memory,
Mm-hmm.
Which is the memory that you have through touch, through your fingers, for instance, as a pianist. I could be totally tuned out. If I'm practicing, occasionally I'll tune out, very occasionally in concerts. And your fingers just do it, right? But I think that happens on an emotional level too. It's not just your fingers doing it, but you have like an emotional memory or it's memory, but it's a kind of awareness. I think there are lots of different levels of awareness when you're playing a piece of music, and it's very interesting and not good to think about when you're doing it.
And I love what you're saying too, in the sense that we're using an attention that isn't our normal waking conscious mind is being employed as well. That's why we nap.
Yes.
And you're reminding me that Wotan, the god, Odin in Norse mythology, but I know him better through Wagner, had 2 ravens who were his messengers and his message bringers, and did scouting for him, and they were called Thought and Memory. There's something in there.
When you first start, you learn to play an instrument, but when you first start to really study the music, particularly of Bach or contrapuntal music in general, and start to understand for the first time what these composers have done, that really does bring you to your knees, because the act of playing it is one thing, but as Simone said, the act of creating it, where did that come from, and how is it possible that somebody actually heard that for the first time? And what will really put you in your place, which I'm sure every student goes through at some point, is when you're asked to write a fugue in theory class. And maybe you're given a subject or maybe you're not, but you try and construct one yourself. And maybe all the rules work if you're pretty good, you know, but to write a piece of music contrapuntally with 3 or more voices that actually sounds like anything is extraordinary. And then you listen to what Bach came up with, and you bow. Yes?
Strikes me that both of you are very adventuresome, creative people, that you like challenges in what you do every day. But how do you deal with the idea of fear? How, as a creative person, do you deal with fear, or are you fearless?
Well, I think that fear is I'm exposing myself to say this in front of all you people, but I think fear is my biggest enemy. It's my biggest problem. Because I think that I have a fear of being fearful. And that is the worst thing to have. If you just can accept that you will experience fear in concert or wherever, and you just know that as part of what the experience is, that's fine. But if you're frightened of that happening, then it can be very, it can be a kind of freezing experience. So I don't feel fearful about making my choices, my musical choices. I feel like I have a lot of conviction, and I feel like it's okay if I make the wrong choices and then later on I make the right choices. Like, I think that that's part of the process, that, or maybe there is no wrong or right, you know, that you're constantly developing, and what I do today will probably be very different than what I do in 10 years. But the fear of not playing how I intend to play, and of something getting in my way, mainly myself, that is the worst thing. So it takes a lot of mind games to get through that.
Yeah, and for me, as a player and as a teacher as well, what I always tell myself and my students is the best possible defense against that specific kind of fear of, you know, am I going to do okay, is preparation. And that's what drives you to practice all those hours every day, I think. But I am actually more interested in the idea of fear of making a wrong musical or creative choice in some way. That's something I hadn't really thought of.
I think no fear, no fun. and no courage without fear. There'd be no point in courage. And I try and listen to my fear. A wise man once said, fear is the beginning of telepathy. And I tried for a long time to figure out what he meant, because he seemed very wise. But it's true, I think. If I'm walking down a relatively deserted city street in not such a nice neighborhood, my antennae are up. And I wonder to what extent my antennae are up as a performer precisely because my fear is helping me. As long as I have enough courage to live with it and not be consumed by it. But I know in some of the circumstances where I've been in the worst psychological shape, I've done my best work. In terms of feeling afraid and being aware of feeling afraid and trying to deal with it. It's still, sometimes I've gotten my best results that way. So I've decided that I'm never going to get rid of it.
And I've made a distinction actually between fear and heightened awareness, which has been helpful for me. And I think that in a concert, you are so aware of every single thing, and that can be an awful thing, but it can also be the most ecstatic and sort of full of life feeling, because you are aware, you are feeling, you're listening. It's like every one of your senses is so heightened. And I can look forward to that feeling, or it can either go into a positive direction or a negative direction. But that to me is a little bit different than being fearful. The fear, and as I said before, it's the fear of the fear that is worse than the fear itself. But I think if it can be thought of as just being really in the moment.
You're making me think of a letter Martha Graham wrote to Agnes DeMille that is full of the most extraordinarily beautiful things, but part of it is regarding the pursuit of perfection, which is part of the fear, as you so eloquently put it, that I won't do what I intended. She says, well, there is no satisfaction whatsoever at any time. And what made me think of it is what you were just saying now, because then she goes on to say, but there is a queer dissatisfaction that makes us feel more alive. And our job is to keep the channel open. And don't judge it, but allow it. That's a very powerful sentiment.
Well, we are just delighted to have both these wonderful artists here with us at Emory. Looking forward to tonight's concert. They both have marathons to run tonight and need to get to their naps. So thank you very much.
I have a quick announcement. Interesting that Robert brought up the program in a couple weeks at the Symphony. We actually are running an Emory discount for that performance. So if you go to atlantasymphony.org/Emory, you'll have all the instructions on how to get discount tickets to that program that Robert was talking about. It's at the end of April, if you want to check that out online.
Thanks to you too, Mr. Ransom. I think you had Carmen O'Brien step aside.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.